We are in this series on the end times. Which if you're new to church is kind of a weird topic, right? Because we're talking about, well, the signs of the times. And many people are like, are we in the apocalypse? Are we approaching the end? And there's all sorts of speculation out there. There's a lot of noise, a lot of chatter. And I just wanted to bring our attention in the last couple of weeks and the couple weeks to come in. What does Jesus say about the end? Because he preaches this whole sermon. So if you came here today as a guest of some child, I apologize in sort of sense, like, yeah, it's not a Mother's Day sermon, but we're just saying, what does Jesus say? And his disciples come to him and ask him these two questions, like, what will be the sign of your coming of the end, and when is it going to happen? When's it going to happen? What are the signs? And so Jesus preaches this sermon on the Olivet Discourse. He's sitting on the Mount of Olives. He's talking this sermon. He's giving the signs of the times. And he's and one of the reality is it describes this thing about the imminent arrival, that Jesus could come at any moment. And from the very first century, right after Jesus ascended into heaven, his disciples have expected him to return at any moment. In the first century, that was their expectation. In the second, third, here we are, 2,000 years later, we still are living in that expectation. The imminent return of Christ. Whatever position or you take viewpoint on the end times, everyone who ascribes to Orthodox Christianity would say, yes, Jesus is going to come, and he could come at any moment. Now, I happen to have a position, and this is the slide right here, and so where we're right here, the little red dot there, right? It's like when you go to the mall, like, where am I? Oh, there I am, and Christ comes, he brings the church up into heaven, with him. There's a judgment seat of Christ, the marriage supper of the Lamb, and while we're, the church, the believers in Jesus Christ are up, separated from the earth, it begins the 7-year tribulation period. It is the resumption and the conclusion of God's covenant promises and his plan with the nation of Israel. People, I think there'll be a great movement of Messianic Judaism in this time. I mean, Messianic, like in terms of, they're Jews, but they're turning to Christ in the period called the Great Tribulation. In the middle of that period is this abomination of desolation where this Antichrist gets up and he declares himself God, worship him, and then it gets really bad. Revelation describes that period, but then he returns at the end. There's the millennium, the final judgment journey. So, my position. In seminary, I had a professor that didn't take this position. He took the opposite position. And so I asked him, Dr. Domini, I said, Bert Domini, he was a tenured professor from Southwestern, the biggest seminary in the world. He was doing an assignment in Canada, for the little mission seminary up in Canada, and there he was, Bert Domini, published theologian, and I said, what if you don't agree? What if I don't agree with you, Dr. Domini? He said, Mike, you read the scriptures, and you come up with what you believe they say, and then you hold to it tenaciously. So the guy that didn't agree with me has encouraged me to believe this and to hold to this, and that's the way I view this. So as we look at the Olivet Discourse, we're just keep this in the back of your head, and you can see that online. You can take a picture of that. This is not original with me. I stole it from someone, and so I'm not that smart or that talented to put that up. But that is just basically the framework that I'm dealing with here. Okay, so we'll jump into the text, because what happens now in verse 32, Jesus begins to tell stories. He's talked about all these signs, all these, pointing towards the end. He said, this is what the tribulation period is going to be like. There's going to be earthquakes. There's, the abomination of desolation. You run to the hills. And then he said, now he's starting to tell stories. And from this point till the end of chapter 25, he's just going to tell story upon story upon story upon story upon story. And what's he trying to do? He's trying to help us to see the point is not to try to figure out all the details or the timetable. The point is, how are you living now in light of what's going to happen? And no matter if you agree with me on my structure there, we would all agree on the points that come out of these stories, that we should be confident, that we should be alert, that we should be ready, that we should be prudent. No matter what position you take, those application points apply to everyone. And so he begins in verse 32. And he says, learn this parable from the fig tree. Whenever its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So I took a picture here. I got a picture here. There's the fig tree blossoming. You guys all understand this. Like, we live in Canada. You know, the enduring winter, right? And then as the snow starts to melt and break and you're outside, and then you notice on the trees are those little fuzzy ends on the branches, the pussy willow, right? When you see that, you know winter is over, spring has begun. And Jesus is like, you know, when you see some of these signs starting to happen, you know the tree's going to blossom and bear fruit. We're getting close to the end. Now, that's the thing. Lisa and I are in the garden, and we're looking, and every year we kind of look at it. Did that thing make it? I don't know. Is it dead? Who knows? Because some plants die over the winter, and some don't. But we always watch, and we wait, and we wait, and we wait. And finally, we see one of these, and we're like, oh, it's not dead. It's coming. And sometimes that doesn't show up. We're like, oh, it's dead. So we yank it out and throw it in the burn pile. And so, but Jesus is like, when you see this, know that summer is coming. Now, some have suggested that this is a reference to 1948 and the restoration of Israel as a nation, and I don't think Jesus was not talking about 1948 here. He wasn't saying that, and now a generation from 1948, that's when Christ is going to return. That's not what he was trying to say. He was saying, as you see the events of the end times, of the tribulation period, you know the bud is on the end of the branch, things are happening. So he says, you see that verse 33? So also you, when you see all these things, know that he is near, right at the door. Verse 34, I tell you the truth. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Which generation? The generation that's living during the tribulation period. The generation that has seen the desolation, the abomination of desolation. That generation, they will not pass away. I mean, the end is really close. And then he says in verse 35, a very interesting word. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. What is Jesus saying this for? Why would he say this? Because there's so many messages we hear out there. And what messages do you believe? I mean, let me give you just one example from one area of life. Okay, this is just predictions about the environment and our world in which we live, okay? October 1958. Some scientists estimate that the polar ice pack is 40% thinner and 12% less in area than it was half a century ago. And that even within the lifetime of our children, the Arctic Ocean may open, enabling ships to sail over the North Pole. The New York Times reported, noting that the Arctic ice sheet was about 7 feet thick at the time. And then the editorial comment from this article from March 23rd of 2023. Currently, the ice is about 7 feet thick, too. There you go. January 1972. We have 10 years to stop the catastrophe, said Maurice Strong, then UN Environmental Secretary, regarding the world's environmental problems, according to the Swedish newspaper. January 1978. An international team of specialists has concluded from 8 indexes of climate that there is no end in sight to the cooling trend of the last 30 years, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, the New York Times reported. A year later, the paper reported the opposite. There is a real possibility that some people now in their infancy will live to a time when the ice of the North Pole will have melted, a change that would cause swift and perhaps catastrophic changes in climate, the New York Times said. November 2007. This year was the defining moment of the climate change fight, according to Rajendra Pachauri, then head of the UN climate panel. If there is no action before 2012, that's too late, the official said, according to the New York Times. November 2007, the Arctic Ocean could be free of ice in the summer as soon as 2010 or 2015, something that hasn't happened in more than 1 million years, Canada's CanWest News Service reported, paraphrasing polar researcher Louis Fortier. December 2007, Arctic summer ice free by 2013, the BBC reported. Okay, this is interesting. June 2008. We're actually projecting this year that the North Pole may be free of ice for the first time in history, said David Barber, University of Manitoba. Do you think a Manitoban would know better than that? Like, come on, you live in the middle of the North Pole. Like, why would you predict that? I can understand someone from like Southern Ontario saying that, but in Manitoba, like you live in the Arctic climate. How do you jeepers? September 2012. Enjoy more snow now. By 2020, it'll be gone, the Australian reported. It still snows in Australia. Last year's snowfall was, in fact, significantly above average. July 2013, ice-free Arctic in 2 years heralds methane catastrophe, scientist, The Guardian reported. January 2018, the chance that there will be any permanent ice left in the Arctic after 2022 is essentially zero, said James Anderson, a Harvard University professor of atmospheric chemistry. December 2021, the New York Times ran a story headlined, "A no snow California could come sooner than you think." A few weeks later, the UC Berkeley Central Sierra Snow Lab announced that California had just had the snowiest December on record. So I'm just trying to tell you that in one area of life that we observe around us, we have heard a consistent message from all angles. It's getting colder, it's getting hotter, the catastrophe, nothing happens. And then you're wondering, who do I trust? And then Jesus comes along and says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Who do you listen to? And so you could apply this to the social area of life, to the financial area of life, to the political area of life, and on and on and on. And there's all these messages, chatter that it's always going on in the background. And then Jesus draws our attention to, if you want a message that you can rely on and trust, listen to Jesus. Remember his first sermon? He ends it by saying, essentially, whoever hears what I'm saying and puts it into action and does it is like a wise person who builds their house on the rock, right? You guys know this story. We used to sing about it. The wise man built, we used to sing it, don't build your house on the sandy land, right? I mean, we get that, but Jesus is like, if you hear and do, you're like that person. Because my words will never pass away. And here we have recorded experts in their field making dire predictions that were all wrong. But Jesus said, my predictions and my words are never wrong. Everything else will pass away. Dissertations will be burned and buried and forgotten, but my words never will. So whose words are you building your life around? In anticipation of the return of Christ, who are you listening to? Who guides your decision making? Whose voice is in your ear? You got a little iPod, the little things in your ears, and you're listening to whatever. What are you hearing? And I'm telling you today that the message you want to hear is Jesus' message. So we can be confident. Because the truth of the matter is that Jesus always gets the last word. Always. Doesn't matter how powerful you are, how much money you have. I mean, our culture is, right? The more money you have, the more you can advertise, the more you can declare what you think to be true because you got the money to put it up front and for everyone to hear it. But it doesn't mean you're right. It just means you have more money and you can afford advertising time. It doesn't mean you're right. Jesus says, my words are always right. I'm kind of camping out there because it's important. Because none of this sermon will make any sense if you don't believe that to be true. He then encourages us with this story, the next section, kind of this parable is about being ready. Verse 36. He says, but as for that day and hour, no one knows it. Not even the angels in heaven, except the Father alone. And I don't understand how this works. How does the Son not know the timing of his arrival if he's God with the Father? I don't understand that. I don't claim to understand how the intricacies of the mystery of the Trinity operate, but he's saying, I don't even know. The angels don't know. So when someone writes on the internet or on TV or on paper that they know when Jesus is returning, they are contradicting Jesus' words here. They are not right. They're wrong. They're a false prophet. Don't listen to them. Anyone that says, oh, it's going to happen, it's not. No. He doesn't even, Jesus said, I don't even know. Only the Father knows that specific time. He says in verse 37, for just like the days of Noah were, so the coming of the Son of Man will be. For in those days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing until the flood came and took them all away. It'll be the same at the coming of the Son of Man. I think I have a picture there. Yeah, there's the ark. There's the water. Okay, we can go back to the verse there if you don't mind. Yeah. Like the story of Noah, right? Like he's building this ark for 120 years, right? Everyone around him like, what are you doing, Noah? What are you doing? And he's telling, look, guys, judgment's coming. We need to prepare for the judgment. Ha, 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 whatever, And they're doing life in ignorance of the fact that something is coming. He keeps traveling further and further away. Why? Because he's cut all the trees close to him. He's got to go further because he needs so many trees to build this massive thing. Like, what are you doing? No, well, God's going to judge. Oh, God's going to judge. Oh, and they're doing life. And all of a sudden, boom, it starts to rain. And they go to the ark and the door's already shut. Who shut the door? God shut the door. The opportunity was over. And the truth of the matter is, you can live your life in ignorance of God, but Jesus is still coming. You won't stop that fact. But in those days, they're like, oh, wow, that's never going to happen. And all of a sudden, boom, it happened. And Jesus is like, it's going to be the same thing. People are going to be like, doing life. And boom. Now, the reality is, even for the Christian, at the day of the rapture, you could be doing life and all of a sudden be surprised that Jesus is rapturing you. And you're like, oh, if I would have known, maybe I would have done some things differently. Maybe I would have realigned my schedule. Maybe I would have found time to invest in some people and do some stuff. I mean, you'll be like, oh, and it's too late at that point. Be ready. He says there in verse 40, then there will be two men in the field. One will be taken, one left. There will be two women grinding grain at the mill. One taken, one left. And so here we are at the end of the tribulation period. Christ returns and there's instant judgment. Those that are faithful remain on the earth. Those that are not are judged and removed. And there it is. And it's like boom, it's over. It's fast. It's instantaneous. And he says in verse 42, here's the command. Therefore, stay alert because you don't know on what day your Lord will come. And that's how he began the section. This is how he ends the section. Be alert. Stay awake. Keep your eyes open. This is the same thing Jesus told his disciples, Garden of Gethsemane. He's like, hey guys, stay alert. Pray that you won't fall into temptation. Okay, Jesus. And what do? They're sleeping, right? You're not staying alert. He's like, stay alert, stay alert. Watch out. On Boxing Day, 2004, people were enjoying the Indian Ocean, swimming on nice beaches. And then all of a sudden the water went out. Like way out, like low tide, below low tide out. Like what is going on? All of a sudden you could see in the distance this mountain of water coming towards them. Like, whoa, what is that? And then it gets closer. That's a wave. No, that is a wave, tsunami. And it crushes these, and this flattens islands. They figure 300,000 people at least died. It's a tsunami of 2004. They weren't ready for it. They weren't watching for it. The moment that water began to recede to a point where it shouldn't be receding, that's like, oh, this is your time to run. And you better run. But it was children that weren't able to get up to the higher ground. Some of those places didn't have higher ground, and so just flooded the whole, populated area. But they weren't watching for the signs. And as Jesus writes this, he's writing for a people living in that period of time that are saying, what do we do? What do we do? And he's like, just be alert. It's coming. The end is close. Just hang in there. You're good, but just stick with me. You can trust me. Be alert. Jesus could come at any time. And he uses another story, verse 43. But understand this. If the owner of the house had known at what time a night the thief was coming, he would have been alert and would have not let his house be broken into. You know that classic movie, Home Alone, Kind of like that, right? He knows they're coming back, right? And he's got, the hot, iron on the doorknob and sticky stuff on the floor and things that are flying through the air. And he's got it all set up. He's waiting for them. Oh, yeah, he can't wait for them to come. He's like, if you knew the thief was coming, you'd be ready, right? In our country, you'd have the shotgun loaded up. You'd have things ready, right? Because that's the reality. It's not a surprise. He's coming. So he says in verse 44, therefore you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you don't expect him. Be ready. Jesus expects us to expect him, to be ready. So, in 1980, they were clearing out Washington State, the area around Mount St. Helens, right? Because everyone felt like it's going to blow, the scientists. And at the top of the mountain, of course, there's this lodge at Spirit Lake there, St. Helens Lodge. And Harry Truman, 84-year-old, and his 16 cats wouldn't leave the lodge. No, I'm staying. And then all of a sudden, they went there May 17th. Look, Harry, you got to leave. I'm not leaving. May 18th, boom. Half the top of the mountain blew off, buried the whole lodge under 50 meters of mud. They've never found Harry or his cats. His niece was interviewed 20 years later, and she's like, he honestly thought that when it blew up, that they'd be able to fly the helicopters in and into the parking lot there and take him out. He thought that there'll be an escape route for me if it does blow. But he had no chance. Be ready. Be ready. That means you got the suitcases packed and you're anticipating movement. Be ready. And then he describes in this last story our need to be prudent. He says, verse 45, who then is the faithful and wise slave, whom the master has put in charge of his household to give the other slaves their food at the proper time? He's the manager. The master who owns everything has said, you're in charge. Look after everything. Look after these other slaves. You're the person, the man or the woman responsible. And he said, blessed is that slave whom the master finds at work when he comes. I tell you the truth. The master will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that evil slave should say to himself, my master is staying away a long time, and he begins to beat his fellow slaves and to eat and drink with drunkards, then the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and an hour when he does not foresee, and will cut him in two and assign him a place with the hypocrites where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's a pretty harsh ending. But it's like, you've been given this responsibility. Now discharge your responsibility faithfully and wisely. There will be people in that day that will be living however they feel like, oh, he's not coming back. I can do whatever I want. And then suddenly the master returns. It's like the Robin Hood movie, right? I mean, there's this evil stuff going on because King Richard's away on the Crusades, and finally he comes back and cleans house and puts Robin Hood into a place of leadership, and they get married, blah, blah, blah. But here it is, like, there's all this evil going on. Why? Because the king is away. The master could come back. I remember my first job. I worked at this farm and garden store, and he gave me the responsibility of cleaning the store. So I had a key, and I would come after hours, after school, and vacuum, clean the bathrooms, and just, do the basic cleaning. It was a 1-2 hour job, whatever it was. Anyway, the one day I was cleaning there, and this big vacuum had this filter, and I took the filter out to clean it off, and then, it kind of bounced on the ground. All this dust came out. Oh, that's kind of cool. So I threw it up in the air, came down, and boom, more dust came out. So I threw it up really high in the air, and it's coming down, and I look, and there's the boss walking through the gate. Just was waiting for the whole earth to open up and swallow me. Steve Hansen was a gracious and a godly man, and he just looked at me and went into his office. He didn't have to say a word. I never threw that thing in the air again. I always checked to make sure that it was clear, the coast was clear. But the one day I was having fun with the filter. The master's returning. He's coming back. He's going to be evaluating your life. If you're doing your job, no worries. If you're not doing your job, be worried. Be aware. The time is short. And you have opportunities now to invest in those things that will last beyond this world. But some of you aren't doing that. And Jesus today with this sermon is inviting you to say, yeah, maybe you need to realign some of your life so that you're doing things that will last after this life, that will serve my kingdom interests into eternity. Be aware of that. This is his reminder. It's like, yeah, if he comes back and you're going against his servants, guess what? He will look after you. And just imagine, this sermon and the book of Revelation has been an encouragement to Christians living in difficult situations, right? For Christians right now in Nigeria, Christians right now in Afghanistan, Christians right now in other parts of the Middle East and South Asia, where they're getting persecuted, arrested, even killed. They read this text and say, yes, all those that fight against the cause of Christ will be summarily judged. They won't get away with it. Even in the tribulation period, as things heat up, it's going to be nasty for Christians. But Jesus is like, yeah, but their end will come and God will look after them. So trust in Jesus now. So anyway, I have the points here. Here they are. Be confident. Jesus always gets the last word. Next is be alert. Jesus could come at any time. Be ready. Jesus expects us to expect him. And be prudent, which that word means acting with or showing care and thought for the future. Be prudent. I know that's not a word you normally use, but I just like the way it says. Acting or showing care and thought for the future. Jesus will bless those who are serving him when he returns. You have been warned from Jesus himself. I'm coming back. I'm going to hold you accountable. So get going, because if you're going, then we're good. If you're not going, then we'll have a conversation about that. Why weren't we going? Don't live like the people of Noah's day. Oh, Jesus, there'll be time for me to do that in the future. Jesus is asking you to invest your life with him today. Don't wait for some elusive period at somewhere. Oh, when I'm retired, when my kids are alone. Just do it now. Because Jesus could return tomorrow, tonight. And during your Mother's Day party, he could come back. Are you ready? So get ready. And if you don't know Jesus as your Savior, I'm inviting you to believe in Jesus Christ today for the promise of eternal life. He offers that to all of us. And then you're not afraid. He comes back, yeah, I'm ready, I'm good, I'm doing what you want. I'm putting your resources that you've given me at your disposal, Lord. It's your stuff, it's your money, it's your time. Let me give it to you in maximum proportions that I can possibly do it. Pour your life out for Jesus and you'll never be disappointed. So Jesus, and he'll continue to tell stories about this. He's not over. The stories he tells from this point forward will continue to reinforce this theme of being ready, of watching, of being alert, of being prudent. So he's going to continue to tell a story. Why? Because he wants us to get this. He's inviting you and me to this. So I'm going to invite the team up. They're going to lead us in it's the closing song here, so you don't miss the buffet line and you're late. I'm not trying to be a downer on this, but just be aware. This is intended to motivate us to do more, to be involved, to make sure our life is heading in the right direction. That we're using everything we have and God's blessed us with for his glory. Faithful, wise servants. And moms have one of the greatest and most important jobs in the world, to nurture their kids with the partnership of their husbands, which means the husband does more than just bring in the check, but he actually is actively involved with the family too. He's talking to his kids about spiritual things. He's serving in the church. He's showing an active involvement in life of faith. But a mother, she grounds that home and provides that stability and that spiritual encouragement and nurture, and that is so important. I cannot emphasize that. If you're being a faithful mother and doing that job at home and Christ returns, good job. He'll be like, way to go. You're doing exactly what I want. And here at NewLife, we're trying to raise up that next generation of leaders, of missionaries, of pastors, of evangelists. They're downstairs right now. But it's the mothers and fathers' work at home that really grounds that. And we just support that. But that's so important. Let's pray as we prepare to sing this final song. Lord, thank you that you're coming back. Help us to be ready. to be watchful, to be prudent, to be confident. Your words will never pass away. May our lives be built upon your word. And I pray for any here that don't know you today as their Savior or watching online. Lord, may they turn to you in faith and believe and discover life and anticipate your coming. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Would you stand with the team?